The source of the Yarlung Tsangpo is a glacial lake at an elevation of 18,000 feet near Mount Kailash in western Tibet. The sources of the Indus, the Sutlej, and the Ganges are also located near this sacred mountain. The Tsangpo, which means South River, is about 1,800 miles long, has a gradient of about 15 feet per mile, and flows through open valleys characteristic of the Tibetan Plateau for most of its length. At the eastern end of the Himalayas, it plunges into the deepest canyon on Earth, over 15,000 feet, and makes a huge bend to the north and then to the south before becoming the Brahmaputra in India. In the Great Bend, it drops at a rate of 50 to 200 feet per mile for about 50 miles, flowing over two major waterfalls. This section has been called the Everest of Rivers. In 1986, Arlene Burns and Dan Dixon took their kayaks on a bus from Nepal to Tibet, hitchhiked to Mount Kailash, and tried to run the entire Tsangpo. Unfortunately, Arlene got high-altitude sickness while kayaking on Lake Manasarova at the foot of Kailash, so they hitchhiked to a lower elevation and only boated the middle stretch of the Tsangpo, from Lhasa to Lhasa. In July 1998, a Chinese team put in at the source of the Tsangpo and spent the next 3 months floating 600 miles to the town of Pai near the entrance to the Great Bend. This was the first major all-Chinese river expedition after the Yangtze and Yellow River disasters in the mid-1980s, and it was widely promoted as a great success. 1998 was a record floodwater year, yet all the boaters survived. The team included ecologists and geographers who took thousands of photos to document the effects of overgrazing and the resulting erosion of the fragile desert landscape. They also hiked the Great Bend to document the locations of Rainbow and Hidden Falls. The Chinese team portaged the Class 5 to 6 rapids in Kanglai Gorge, Lang Canyon, and Gayatse Gorge. In 2007, a team of expert kayakers organized by Chris Jones of Windhorse Adventures, including Willie Kern and Jen Weingarten, completed first ascents of Lang Canyon and Gayatse Gorge. Unlike the Tsangpo in the lower Great Bend, the 10-mile-long Kanglai Gorge is probably runnable at low flows. In 2002, Shangri-La River Expeditions, a division of Earth Science Expeditions, attempted to run the Rakha Tsangpo, a large tributary to the Yarlung in central Tibet, but had to change their plan due to drought. Fortunately, they were able to run a first ascent of a 30-mile section of the Rakha headwaters in 2005. Shangri-La team was able to convince their Chinese host, Liu Li, and their Tibetan interpreter, Chong Dak, to let them run Rinqing Ding Gorge of the Yarlung Tsangpo instead of the Rakha Tsangpo in 2002. Liu Li knew Feng Chuan, who had led the first descent of the Upper Yarlung during the 1998 flood. Chong Dak had been a tour guide for English-speaking bus, jeep, and trekking tours for 7 years, but this was his first river trip. He entertained the team with so many funny stories about tourists that they decided he could probably get a job in the U.S. as a stand-up comedian. Due to the lower water level in 2002, the Shangri-La team was able to camp near the Gangatashi Monastery and visit both the monastery and the village which had built it, marking the first time that foreigners had visited him. Most of the villagers were out herding sheep and goats on the steep canyon walls or tending irrigated barley fields on terraces below the village, but a few older women were home cooking or weaving. The village had 9 families, with about 10 per extended family, and each family owned about 120 goats and sheep. The children walked 2 days to a boarding school for 2 months each year. The villagers visited the river camp later that day and quickly learned to win at ammo box tug-of-war, where each contestant balances on a box in the sand, and the first one to cause the other to lose his balance or drop the rope wins. They also found the kayak clowns to be very entertaining. For them, the river is a hazard and a graveyard, not a place for recreation. In 2002, Shangri-La River Expeditions also did a first ascent of the Upper Kaichu, a major tributary to the Tsangpo which flows through Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. Like most rivers on the Tibetan Plateau, for most of its length the Kaichu flows over gravels deposited at the end of the last ice age. In 2003 and 2004, Chris Jones of Windhorse Adventures completed first ascents of the remaining sections of the Kaichu and its major tributaries. Many of these have cut canyons and bedrock and have some challenging whitewater sections. While the Chinese team hiked the Great Bend in November 1998, Wick Walker arrived at Pai with 4 top-notch U.S. kayakers sponsored by the National Geographic Society. The summer flood was rapidly subsiding, but the kayakers, Tom and Jamie McEwen, Roger Zabel, and Doug Gordon, had no way of getting information about the actual flow because the only gauge on the river had washed away in August at 400,000 CFS. They estimated the flow to be 40 to 50,000 CFS, which is extremely high for the 50 to 200 feet per mile gradient in the Great Bend. The Walker team boated about 35 miles before Doug Gordon, their most experienced big water kayaker, drowned in a huge pour-over. The remaining 3 kayakers and the land support team hiked the entire canyon looking for him without success.
As he nears the drop, the team watches from shore, knowing that Doug must hug the rocks on the right where the current is manageable. The river drags him towards the heart of the falls. It flips him upside down. Pulls him. And this time, it doesn't let him go.
There's always a part of you, though, that sort of instantly goes into denial and says, no, it's not going to happen. Somehow, by some miracle, he's going to get out.
I saw him disappear into the first hole, and I never saw him again. I really, honestly, all the time I thought he would roll up and battle him with Yeti. I really was not that afraid for him until the horror of the last roll attempt. He was that poised and confident about it. He could pull stuff out at the very last minute. And I was wrong.
Steve Curry, owner of the expedition company, brought Scott Lindgren and Charlie Munsey to Tibet to run the Great Bend of the Tsangpo in 1998. They arrived at about the same time as the Walker team, but decided not to attempt it due to the high water. Lindgren, hoping for a more successful run of the Great Bend, arrived in Pei in February 2002 with an international team of kayakers sponsored by Outside Magazine and Chevy Avalanche. Johnny Kern, Alan Edard, Mike Abbott, Willie Kern, Dustin Knapp, and Steve Fisher. With a land crew consisting of 80 Tibetan and Nepali porters, they had lighter kayaks than the Walker team. At a flow estimated at 15,000 CFS, they were able to run many of the rapids that the Walker team had portaged in 1998, plus many of the rapids over the next 17 miles.
I guess I was a little bit far right and lost my balance as I went past the edge of the hole, hit the edge of the hole, and kind of got eddied out in the backwash. And when I rolled up, I was heading straight back up stream to a pretty ugly slot.
The expedition is perhaps better described as kayak packing. They carried their boats much further than they paddled them. When they finally reached a point where they couldn't paddle or portage, they climbed 3,000 feet to reach a path around the gorge. They managed to climb down to the 110-foot-high Hidden Falls, which had been discovered by Tibetans centuries ago, but was only publicized in the West in the late 1990s. They had originally planned to continue down the Yarlung Tsangpo below its confluence with the Po, a large tributary which drains into the northernmost curve of the Great Bend. However, in 2000, a huge landslide which had dammed the Yarlung Tsangpo, a large tributary to the Po, failed, and the resulting flood scoured the main river channel, leaving sheer cliffs with no possibility of scouting or portaging. Lindgren and Munsey had also tried to kayak the Po Tsangpo in 1998, but after boating about 10 of the 40 miles to the confluence with the Yarlung Tsangpo, they gave up due to the high water level. In 2002, after running the section of the Tsangpo in the Great Bend in February at low water, the Lindgren team successfully boated the Po down to its confluence with the Tsangpo, finishing the run he and Munsey had aborted 4 years earlier due to high water. A Japanese kayaker, Yoshitaka Takai, drowned near the confluence in 1993, shortly after putting in to run the lower section of the Yarlung Tsangpo in the Great Bend. In 1999, Steve Curry of the expedition company organized the first ascent of the Parlung Tsangpo, the other main tributary to the Po. The 50-mile trip was a lot like the Middle Fork of the Salmon, Idaho, a Class 4 river flowing through pine forests with spectacular views of mountain scenery. 2003 and 2004, Chris Jones of Windhorse Adventures led first ascent expeditions on the Yigong and its larger tributaries. Jones also ran a first ascent of the Upper Parlong in 2004 with Clive Williamson and a group of kayakers from England. As of 2004, most of the runnable stretches of the Yarlung Tsangpo and its major tributaries have been explored. The Chinese have announced that they plan to dam the Yarlung Tsangpo in the Great Bend and are moving all of the villagers out of the area. They also plan to establish a wildlife preserve in the Mount Mamchibaro area within the Great Bend. In a decade or so, motorized ferry boats carrying tourists and wildlife photographers will float high above Hidden Falls and the Everest of Rivers on their way to Chinese resorts on the new reservoir.